welcome and congratulations on coming, and thank you so much for coming in this horrendous weather. It was a little worse than predicted, so I'm sorry that we didn't cancel, but hey, you know, most of you made it, so that's great. It's just New England. We're New Englanders, right? We can do it. And so I just wanted to let you know, for those of you who are new, who's new to the Somerville Museum, anyone here? Okay, so quite a number of you. So we're a community-based museum. We do art, history, and culture of Somerville. We do local, we preserve local stories. We collaborate with the community to produce this program. This exhibition is called Crafting the Mind, and it is part of our community curator program. Rachel May and Danielle Kirchmer are here. They are the curators of the exhibition, and they will tell you a little bit more about it. But what we do is we send a call out to the community and invite people to submit applications to do exhibitions that relate to Somerville on some level, or interpret Somerville, or reflect the community. So we also have a tavern talk for those of you who like history. We do tavern talks about monthly, and we have one this Monday at Aeronaut Brewery with Dan Green. It is part 2 of the Henry Knox story. It's amazing how many people don't know about Henry Knox. He's a very important revolutionary figure. And so, and Dan tells a great story. If you missed the first part, come at 6:30, you'll hear a recap of the first part, and then the second part as well. On February 13th, we have a Valentine's mixer here, which should be a lot of fun. We'll have some Latin music and some chocolate tasting, and some digital portraiture against some of these artworks. So it'll be a nice, fun party. And if you want to learn more about the museum, or you can think about volunteering or joining as a member, please come see me. Also, we'll have an open house on March 1st, and many things in between. So please sign our mailing list. We do a lot of programming here. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to our curators. Well, actually, just Rachel May is going to be speaking, but Danielle can raise her hand and wave and say hello. Rachel. He's past you. Sorry, didn't plan my approach. Thank you.
Glamorous entrance.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here in the snow. It was a triumph to get here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. This exhibition combines the history of McLean and their use of textiles as occupational therapy with works by contemporary fiber artists. There are 28 artists in the show.
And as part of the, in addition to today's archivist talk, we will be having a curator walkthrough later in March, I think March 14th. I know we're checking if it's on the Somerville Museum website, and we'll be having a workshop with one of the contemporary artists in the exhibit, Lauren Leone, Crafting Care. So those are some of the upcoming events that we have in addition to today's amazing talk with Terry Bragg. Rachel, introduce Terry. Farewell. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Terry, and especially for getting here on your long journey through the snow. Terry has been the archivist at McLean since 1981, and he's known as the resident expert on campus. He's the person to whom everyone turns when they need information about the hospital's founding and its history across the years. He served as the hospital registrar. Was.
I retired.
He retired. He retired a few years ago, but the hospital lured him back. And he has helped manage faculty appointments and promotion processes. He helped recruit faculty from abroad and manage their visa processes so that they could stay and do their work. And he's more recently collaborated on research about the history of electroconvulsive therapy and about the use of anesthesia at McLean. I'm very grateful to him for his expertise and the time he's given me for the past 4 years. I went to McLean for OCD treatment in 2010, and then a few years ago I went back and said, Terry, I need to know what would have happened to me if I was here in the 1800s. And then I continued to pepper him with questions for the next 4 years. And he's shown me so many amazing pieces from the archives that have helped me learn about its history and helped me understand the history of mental health care in the U.S. So thank you again for being here, Terry. I'm eternally grateful to you and really excited that you're able to give this talk today. Please welcome Terry Bragg.
I want to start actually before the first slide here and say that you look at the Revolutionary War, you look at Boston, there's about 24 physicians in Boston at the time for about a population of 10 or 12,000. By 1810, there's about 58 physicians to a population of 33,000. So you've got a 1 to 500 or 600 ratio of physician to inhabitant. There's no hospital, medical treatment is given at the home. Those who are indigent, treatment was given at the almshouse or the infirmary. So before John Warren and James Jackson wrote the circular letter, Reverend Bartlett, who was in charge of the almshouse in Boston, was the one who actually enlisted Drs. Warren and Jackson to write the circular letter. The letter went out to the most wealthiest people in the Commonwealth, particularly Boston, but primarily Boston proper, and asking for their support and their financial philanthropy to begin to develop a hospital. The circular letter raised everyone's interest. It led to the charter that was granted by the Massachusetts legislature in February of 1811 as the Massachusetts General Hospital Corporation. It was initially to be one institution, and as a result of the War of 1812, nothing really happened in Boston until 1814, when the French finally cleared the harbor. We were able to fundraise at that point in time. They raised almost $95,000 in less than a couple weeks' time. Over half of it was earmarked for an asylum. It didn't mean that they were actually going to build two institutions at that point. It just happened that a piece of land, the Joseph Barrel estate, his heirs, Benjamin Joy, seeking to sell the property. The Barrel estate was the largest and most expansive country estate outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And just to give you a sense of Joseph Barrel's renown was when George Washington as president came to visit Massachusetts and needed a carriage ride to Worcester, Massachusetts. It was Barrel's carriage and horses that took him there. So we have the circular letter, and it is what the MGH Corporation would say was the beginnings of our history. And then you have the charter, then you have the purchase of the property, which was 18 acres for about less than $16,000. The trustees hired Charles Bullfinch to convert the Barrel estate into an asylum. As you see in the middle was the Barrel Mansion, which Bullfinch himself had designed in 1792. You have wings off of that, male, female, separated. Those with more difficult cases further out, those who were more able to have grounds privileges and the like, or who actually ate with the superintendent's family in the mansion house, were closer to it. This is how actually that looked as of being constructed and having, this is approximately about 1890, this photograph taken of it with the mansion house, and noticing that the third story on that mansion house was actually added in the 1820s by Matthew Paris, who was a a protege of Bullfinch. In September, the trustees send out the announcement, opening of the asylum for October. Rules for admission that everyone was reviewed by a trustee and the superintendent at the time. Part of it was there's no voluntary admission, so it's required commitment to the institution. Also, there was an important part of it was who was going to pay for the services rendered. So in fact, you have opening in October 1 of 1818. The MGH opens in 1821. So in fact, the asylum is actually the first hospital in New England. One of the trustees and benefactors, John Belmont, I show him partly because his sister, Mary Belmont, was a very large donor to the institution of about $90,000 in 1832. But there's no portrait of Mary Belknap that I can find will actually show her. Maybe a place of women in society at that time as well. Our first superintendent, Rufus Wyman, a country doctor from Chelmsford, Massachusetts. It's rather mysterious how he was chosen in some ways. Benjamin Pickman put his name into the hat, so to speak, for the trustees to consider him. There was one other person who was very much lobbying for the position, a man named Dr. Parkman. Dr. Parkman wanted the trustees to not only appoint him head of the institution, but he also wanted them, and this is before they really had thought about how they were going to do the Barrow Mansion and develop it, was he wanted them to purchase some of his property as well for an asylum, but that wasn't going to be in Charlestown at the time, which became a part of Somerville and redistricting. So Rufus Wyman was actually chosen, and rather fortuitous, I think, in some ways, because there's a book written on the disappearance of Dr. Parkman. Dr. Parkman met an unfortunate death. Professor Webster of Harvard College at the time, Dr. Parkman, I think, was somewhat of a loan shark, and had loaned Dr. Webster large sums of money and wasn't getting repaid in his way he wanted to, and he would berate Professor Webster even on the street, and eventually Dr. Webster killed him, cut him up, and burned him in the furnace of the basement of the chemistry building. And it became one of the early court cases on insanity. So it's an interesting book to read if you ever want to have a fun time. However, fortunately, he wasn't selected, and Rufus Wyman was. And a very fortunate selection it was indeed. Dr. Wyman, in his first 14 years at the institution, was absent 5 days. He raised his family there. 2 of his sons became physicians in Boston as well. He was a proponent of moral treatment philosophy. He didn't believe in bloodletting. He did use restraints, primarily hand muffins. He didn't believe in straitjackets and the like. He used very, I would say, a small modicum of medicine at that time. Partly it was just a reflection, like any other physician at the time, let alone somebody who was treating the mentally ill, what little they had available to them. So it was primarily, purgatives. Occasionally they would use, that I've discovered in writings and the like, some morphine and the like to calm the most manic, but primarily it was diversions, exercise, a standard diet regimen. He purchased a carriage house for the patients to take rides. He set up an early woodworking shop for men. There was labor done on the farm. as the Barrel mentioned, it had a farm on its property as well. So it was a somewhat self-sufficient institution. Now, this is an early annual report, and I use this partly to, it's a sense of, the McLean was an experiment of sorts. You don't have that Worcester State Hospital didn't come into play until the early 1830s. So during the 1820s, McLean was outside of Friends Hospital in Philadelphia, New York Hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital. We were we preceded Hartford Institute of Living. So we are that experiment. And they wanted to show how successful they were. Well, some people died at the institution, and that was primarily from old age or from tuberculosis or other illnesses that were at the time. You have this number of not improved. You have the improved, then you get the larger number of much improved, and then you get the larger number yet of recovered. And in fact, I would have to say that the statistics aren't necessarily to be not believed. It's more that, so how many, I guess, no one's ever studied how many recovered, became a patient again, and were readmitted during this time period. That's just never happened. But the statistics prove one point is that many of those 19 people, and of those 10, so the majority of the 29, did return to their prior families and homes and lives. Now you look at the stores balance down at the bottom left, and you look at the amount of money that's spent on stationery of $52, then you go down to medicine, about $89, and that gives you a sense of how much money, how much was really spent on medicines at that time period. Primarily it was spent on other contingencies, which would have been more the moral treatment diversions that were used.
Chief, what is eloped in this context?
Eloped is, those are people who their families did not keep them for the standard 3-month treatment period that they were wanted. So they were considered eloped. It's not that they escaped, like you might think. It was that the family removed them prior to the 3-month time. And then there was one that was determined shortly upon admission to be unfit for their treatment, and they didn't feel that there was even a potential of cure at that time. Yes, I had a long time myself to think about that word and what it meant. I thought it was escape. This is John McLean, a portrait of him, Boston merchant, $25,000 to the asylum. He also gave money to Harvard College for the establishment of the classics professorship. His wife passed away. The other $90,000 came to the institution. The portrait was presented in 1825. He passed away in 1823. So the portrait was actually painted after his death by Gilbert Stuart, who said, I remember him leaning out of a carriage in Boston, and I can paint his portrait. And everybody said it was a likeness of him that they would never have expected on campus. So this is what we have. He was, his father was Scotch, came over to Maine, went to Milton, Massachusetts, where he established a chocolate and paper factory on the Neponset River, what I consider the Baker chocolate factory of most recent vintage. And he went to Milton Public Schools. They made their money not only in that business, but of course in the shipping, not only the Far East trade, which is where his last ship came in from China and brought in, basically he'd gone broke a few times in his career, and his career was revived with that last ship coming in near the end of his life. But he also was, like any other merchant of that time, a slave trader as well from the West Indies.
So his ship really did come in.
His ship really did come in. And in fact, he called a meeting, a dinner for all of his creditors. Underneath their plates was a check to each of them with interest and the money owed to them. So that partly is why I think that endeared him to, I'm sure, some of the trustees of the Massachusetts General Hospital in so many ways as well. But also, he and his wife had no children. So that I think, too, that became a logical place for them to devote some of their monies. But this is one of the gymnasiums on the property at the Barrow Mansion. So billiards is played, we've got a bowling alley, 9 pins there. That was the men's, and then there was women had their own gymnasium as well. Our second superintendent, Thomas G. Lee, was very important he was assistant physician for a couple years under under Rufus Wyman. But when Wyman retired, he became superintendent. There's no portrait of him, no photograph of him, pre-photography, but no painting of him that I have found. He had trained in Hartford at the Institute of Living. He came to McLean at a very young age. He actually died within a year and a half of being a superintendent on visit to Samuel Woodward at Worcester State Hospital. Even reading the newspaper account, it doesn't say why. It could have been typhus, it could have been tuberculosis, unknown to say. But he was instrumental in not only carrying on the moral treatment philosophy, but he's the one who set up the first patient library. They had dances, they had religious services. He carried that moral treatment philosophy to the next level. Then the trustees went on to find Luther Bell. He was actually from New Hampshire, had been a state senator, had been championing the cause of the setting up of the first state hospital in Concord in New Hampshire. They tapped him to be the third superintendent of the McLean Asylum. This is a portrait of him that painted, but I want to show you, the next is a photograph of him. Here he is. There's the real Luther Bell, as I call him. Founding member of the American Psychiatric Association, one of the original 13 founders, wrote a paper on Bell's Mania, one of the first papers published in the fourth volume of the American Journal of Insanity. Bell's Mania it was called, but it was really, I think, a statement of psychotic disorder, maybe how we would put it today's terms. He was a very good friend of Dorothea Dix, who lived with he and his family when she wasn't championing the cause of the mentally ill. I've seen letters of his that were on file at Johns Hopkins and the like, where his letters of introduction of her to various people to get, because she was a woman, she couldn't appear before various state legislatures. Her pamphlets would be presented by some local senator, such as at Massachusetts in 1843 when she gave an address here. And it was, again, she had gone to various jails and the like to write about the disturbing treatment that people were receiving. Luther Bell was also a member of the education reform movement in Massachusetts. Very, very ahead of his time. He also was he published a book on heating and ventilation of buildings, and he brought steam heat into the asylum. He got running water brought into the asylum, and near the end of his career in the early 1850s, he brought in gas for lighting. This is a famous picture of the McLean Asylum, where you start to see the railroads that were encroaching upon the property, started encroaching on the property as early as the late 1830s. By the 1840s, you have brick kindling factories, you have slaughterhouses. I understand, by about the 1870s, they were starting to fill in Miller's River because it was so polluted. So our tranquil environment of the asylum and part of its therapeutic regimen was disappearing. That picture appeared in this Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, May 16, 1853. It's the first illustrated newspaper in America. Frederick Gleason was the publisher. His mansion house was where the Franklin Park Zoo is today. But in fact, Luther Bell wrote, the base of this major article on McLean Asylum is Luther Bell talking about the building of the next two buildings on campus, what became known as the men and women's Appleton houses, which were going to be suites, housing suites, 8 suites for patients with their own bathroom, their own sitting room and the like, to attract a more wealthy class of patients to the institution. And this is also now, you've got Worcester State Hospital in operation. There's another one coming on board at this time. And so he's starting to look at the finances of the hospital and how to keep it going and how to attract that kind of patient. And this is in fact a picture of one of the men's applicants. Now I want to actually say that McLean, people have a sense of McLean only treated a very wealthy, higher socioeconomic class of patients. Not true. I will say true during the Great Depression, but 19th century, there's a study that was done by Superintendent Edward Cowles that showed that 60% of the patients treated between 1818 and 1894 paid less than the cost of their care. And in fact, the Appletons, Samuel, William, both of them who became presidents of the corporation, left money not only to build the Appleton buildings along with a bequest from Joseph Lee, but also they left $10,000, $20,000 for free med care or to cover expenses for those who fully could cover their care in the institution. And then you see right here at this museum, there's a portrait of Mary, and Mary had a little lamb. And the second floor is a whole story about it. Mary Sawyer, John Tyler, the steward. She became the head matron of the female attendants at the hospital. She helped establish the Mary Belknap Sewing Society, or circle with female patients. And they both of them, her husband and she devoted their lives to the institution. Over 30 years of service. In fact, her husband, Columbus Tyler, I believe, was the person who recorded not only the financial books, but also the patient records that we have from 1818 forward. This is a bird's eye view of the McLean Asylum. After the Bowditch building was built, which is the large building to the far right, in the foreground, you see next to the two back, beside that are the two Appleton houses. The Bowditch building brought the asylum to really be housing close to 180 patients in total, although that number was exceeded on occasion. But we didn't, we were different than the state hospitals where they had to take many who came, and the overcrowding was of a very serious nature. McLean, Bell, as of 1842-44, were starting to turn away admissions, and by 1854, over half the people seeking admission were unable to accommodate them. So, the hill is gone, the buildings are gone. I can't.
The space,
It became a railroad changing yard. At one point, I used to use the Holiday Inn as a reference point, but I. Yes. John Tyler, gentleman who followed. The person who followed Luther Bell, Chauncey Booth, who had been his assistant for many years, passed away within a year or so of being superintendent of tuberculosis, in fact. So I jumped to John Tyler, being the first lecturer on mental diseases at Harvard. And it really follows him right after he retired from McLean, that he did all of this. He was carried on Luther Bell's moral philosophy, the diversions and the like, but also he had a religious, he was part of the religious movement within the United States at that time, and so he was the first one to bring a chaplain on for every Sunday, but he had patients, they were dancing, there was, male, female, being able to interact. He tried to I would say, make a community out of the institution, and so he broke down some of the barriers of separating patients by sex and the like. And he also, one of the things that all of these superintendents, I must mention, they hired attendants. The attendants were not able to strike a patient no matter what. There was to be calmness. They would be treated as a companion. And if you didn't follow that, you were let go immediately. They were primarily hired from many school teachers, from actually the Maritimes of Canada. This is some of the cooks in attendance in that time period. I like the dog posing, you've got the cat in front of the window. I call it, these are the people behind the scenes that made the place work. The attendants were there. There was no vacation policy at McLean until 1877. And then finally the trustees came up with a 2-week vacation policy. And Dr. Jelly, the superintendent who followed Dr. Tyler in 1873, asked the trustees to consider having a female physician hired as an assistant. They didn't act on it. I find it though, he's the one who instituted the 2-week vacation policy too, so I give him a lot of credit for somebody who couldn't do anything because they knew they were looking for a new place for the asylum at that point. So he was in this holding pattern of trying to maintain buildings and keep the patient population, keep everybody's spirits up, knowing that as you look around, the outside of the institution is not what it once was. So you have the recreation field, croquet, we have baseball being played. Ken Burns wanted to use this photograph in his baseball history, but we came to the conclusion that we didn't know who was patient, who was employee, and then we didn't want to, take away anybody's confidentiality by having that, because we figured there would be somebody seeking to look at every face and everything here. So it remains just in our collection. Although he said it was one of the earliest views that he had found of this being played recreationally.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a case where Charles Stewart was the guy that jumped off the bridge after he was
Yes.
discovered that he had murdered his wife. And that's the case that just basically said that once you die, confidentiality dies. So all of his medical records were released. So, you might be able to just put things out. But there's a difference between ethics and the law, I should say.
Yes. And HIPAA still has a 50-year, and McLean has it forever, in perpetuity. We do allow people to use records for demographic and longitudinal studies and the like, but unless family has given specific permission or executors of estates, that we don't allow biographical works in that regard. But this is the man, George Jelly, who was the vacation person and the person who recommended the female assistant being hired. We have then the trustees decide that they're going to look for a new site and hire Frederick Law Olmsted in 1872 to look at different sites. He looked as far away as Dorchester, Plymouth, Brookline, Arlington. In fact, I believe he was looking at one site because it says this Waltham, but I think it was where the Metropolitan State Hospital once was, because it was on a hill. However, and there was also another gentleman, a local landscape engineer, Joseph Curtis, was also looking at other sites for the trustees simultaneously. And I understand that Curtis probably got that position because he was a surveyor for the chairman of the board, Samuel Elliott, for local work on his behalf, but he was also engaged for this process. This is the only surviving sketch attributed to Olmsted. However, I had an Olmsted scholar come to the campus and definitely identify it as an Olmsted, and you have a slightly different arrangement than what was eventually built on campus. However, you have Olmsted really talking about judiciously thinning the glade of forest. You've got a great view. You've got southern exposure. You've got, he wanted it like a community, again with the organization of the hospital buildings and the like, and you've got the walkways. Charles Beveridge, who is the Olmsted editor of the Olmsted Papers, who edited 12 volumes, has written about the significance of our campus in Belmont as being the most, true to Olmsted's ideas and philosophy of any hospital that he was involved with in construction and layout. This is how we were actually built. The reason why we're different is partly because we had a new superintendent, Edward Cowles. We have the layout, and I want to point out that this building right here in the foreground in the middle was the first building on campus. They purchased the property in 1875. They built this first building, the MGH did. It was the MGH Convalescent Home. I think the first really Spalding rehab, because it was a rehab facility for those rehabbing in the countryside from the general hospital. Although they discovered that after about 15, 20 years of service that it was financially not viable. So they gave us the building. But in the meantime, the hospital was constructed from 1892 to 1895. I found fascinating that this 1893 pen and ink, which was done by E.L. Doan at the request of the superintendent, it's exactly how the buildings were built prior to them being built. The largest building on our left, right, sort of in the middle, is Upham Memorial Building. It was a gift of George P. Upham in memory of his son. He was a member, graduated from Harvard. He hired his Harvard classmate to be the architect. I find out that the two of them were the first people who rejected being inducted into the Hasty Pudding Club because they didn't wish to go through the hazing. So we have all these buildings being built. Cowles is planning on what to do. By this time, in 1892, Cowles at the asylum has changed the name from McLean Asylum to McLean Hospital. And here we have Joseph Curtis, the man standing there in the middle. The guy at the top was Levi Green, who was the engineer. These are the people who laid out our Belmont campus. We were built by Italian immigrants who lived on campus. We would have the tunnels being built at this time that still exist today. The campus, when I came to McLean, by 1912 it was 318 acres. It was a little smaller than that when I came in 1981 because the town had taken some of the property for a housing development down in the corner of Chapella Road and Mill Street. However, now that we've gone through a transformation of the grounds, though, we have most of the original buildings are still intact. A view of the hospital looking up from that Upham Memorial to the administration building. The other building to the right was Appleton House, the first building on campus open for female patients. Upper was for male patients. Both of those buildings had suites of 8 on each floor, so they housed 16 patients in total. And the nurses didn't have a nursing place to live. They lived on the 3rd floor of the inpatient buildings. So we have Edward Cowles, and I start to back up a little bit in time, but Cowles was influenced by the German scientific movement in the late 1880s, 1890s. Wilhelm Gisinger was one of the people, Emil Kraepelin. His best friend, though, was G. Stanley Hall from Johns Hopkins, who went on to be he was a child and adolescent psychologist, who went on to be head of Clark University and was founding a graduate school. Cowles, when he took some time off and he went to meet with Hall and came back with his idea about research and beginning research in a mental hospital. Also, Cowles came up with the idea of nursing school in a psychiatric hospital. Now, Cowles has an interesting history himself. He graduated from Dartmouth. His first position after graduating was a surgeon at Gettysburg in the Union Army. It left a lasting impression, I'm sure. He stayed in the Army until 1871 when he was hired to be the head of Boston City Hospital. And from there, we recruited him in 1879. But at Boston City, he was such a regimented, formal person that he actually got Boston City Hospital to begin to take in the indigent poor and provide services to them in Boston. And then he brought that philosophy even further to McLean, but also he helped start a nursing school at Boston City Hospital as well with Linda Richards, the first American trained nurse. She advised and consulted with him on the first nursing school. And I look at this photograph and I say, where's the smiles? I think they're overtired. They've been working all night. They've come down for the picture. But we were also the first nursing school to accept male nurses. The nursing school closed in 1968, and over 1,000 graduates, 450, some of them were male graduates. In fact, some of our male graduates were actually founding members of the Massachusetts Nursing Licensing Board. And here's the asylum medical staff in 1891. So we have Cowles on the far right. Next to him is George Tuttle, his first assistant physician, seated Lucia Woodward, the second superintendent of nurses, who started out as an attendant at McLean Asylum in 1864 and retired as head of the nursing school and nursing department in 1912. Beside her, we have Miss Gilbert, her assistant. Now in the front row, we have Dr. Noyes on the left, our pathologist. Doctors Huddleston and Fuller were residents at the time. And then at the back, on the far left, is Dr. Locke, with the mustache and the second one in from him. Dr. Locke went on to be Babcock went on to be head of the South Carolina State Hospital. Mr. Willis and Mr. Bradbury were our two sort of like administrative stewards, purchasing agents, and facilities managers. Our early pathology physiology lab. Our first female physician, Emma Morris, a pathologist, graduate of Michigan Medical School. Lived in Arlington. She then left McLean after 3 years. I don't know if she practiced as a physician other than in the pathology laboratory. That I don't know that she practiced clinically. I haven't found any records to suggest that. She then came back from Europe after a 3-year stay, and she worked with E.E. Southard at Harvard. There's been an article actually written about her. and she ended up sadly dying young with streptococcus after an autopsy. Our experimental psychology laboratory, Shepherd Ivory Franz was actually teaching physiology at Dartmouth when Cowles recruited him. He was our first primate researcher at McLean. Some of his studies, and published a paper in 1908, 1909. Gilbert Van Tessel Hamilton, who was a fellow, physician fellow at McLean, worked with Franz. Hamilton was also taking courses from Robert Yerkes when he was teaching at Harvard. And I think that's where the connection with the primate research came around. In fact, I have no papers from Franz at McLean, though Franz's papers appear in Yerkes' papers at Yale. And they exchanged correspondence after the McLean years. But Gilbert Van Tessel Hamilton also was exchanging letters with Yerkes. They kept up throughout their life. And in fact, when Hamilton became a physician, a private physician for one of the McLean patients who went on to the West Coast, he was involved in establishing the primate research laboratory at UCLA. Otto Foley, our first clinical chemist. Cowles recruited him from West Virginia University. He was a graduate of U of Chicago. His research was in metabolism studies, urine and metabolism studies. They were all negative, but everybody, even 40 years later, was saying there was no reason to repeat any of them because he went on to be the first professor of biochemistry at Harvard Medical School. Just a methodical methods person, wrote a book on methods. We're fortunate to have him at the beginning. Also, one of his pupils was John C. Whitehorn, who went on to become, eventually came back to McLean and became head of research in the 30s. This is McLean Hospital, it's an administration building, prior to the 1938 hurricane that came through. Because all those balustrades were gone by the end of that hurricane. It took McLean 5 years to recover from that. Trees were down through tunnels and the like. I have photographs of it. It's quite a stunning devastation. That far up into, because it came out of Rhode Island and up through. The worst ever in New England, I believe. Hope Cottage, our first single patient cottage. The Olmsted biographer has said that, oh, well, she thought Olmsted was the first patient at this, or a patient at this cottage. Well, in fact, that's not true. She used cottage as a small c and not a large c. And in fact, I believe Olmsted, who died at McLean Hospital as a patient, as recorded in newspapers from the New York Times and the like, in old age, probably was either in Proctor or Bowditch on our campus. The person who was the first patient here was, well, a family member of Sarah Matchett. Sarah Matchett, actually, I've discovered, owned the property. She owned a piece of our property that McLean never owned from the beginning, off of Mill Street. She built this. We provided a single patient cottage. We provided the nursing staff, the physician staff. The family provided the cook, the maids for the patient. She actually then, Sarah Matchett, went on in 1905 to be our first donor to research at McLean. Appleton House, like I say, the first female physician house on our campus, with 8 suites. I'm going to give you some interior views here. Patient bedroom, and living room, a lobby, of which all that woodwork is still there today. It's really quite beautiful. However, you see a lot of the ferns and flowers and the like. We had our own greenhouse on campus, just like they did actually at the asylum itself as well. again, you get just a sense of this is fine living, as I call it in some ways. You did felt like you were right at home. Proctor House was male inpatient. Thomas Proctor himself made his money in the leather industry. He was the first donor to provide monies, sort of asking for a matching gift before it could be used. And they were able to match it a few years later with the administration building at McLean has a big plaque in its parlor, and it talks about Chester Lilly Pierce. And the Pierce family, he donated a sizable sum of money, whereas where we could pay off the debt of building, constructing actually the McLean Hospital. Now McLean was built for about $1.4 million in its original state. So with the Pierce money, Proctor money, not only to build Proctor House, but also to provide for the maintenance of the building for years to come. Here's an interior view of Proctor. We've got our piano. Yes. Our parlor, our dining room, North Belmont. Oh, a menu. And here we have what's made in the central kitchen versus what's made in the house kitchen. They ate very well because we had our own farm. So you've got sausage, you've got mutton chops, you've got beef steak, you've got veal cutlets. You went to the town to get your fish, your smelt and the like, but we had our own bacon. So there's a lot of it self-sufficient. We had our own apple orchard. We made enough orchards, that, apples that had cider and the like to furnish it to the MGH. We had our own dairy farm. We provided milk to the MGH. The farm actually ended in World War II when we didn't have enough people to staff the hospital, let alone the farm. Well, this is, I have a couple of menu books like this that are art room. We had an art room established in the women's gymnasium at the recommendation and suggestion of a patient. And the trustees and their friends, the wives of the trustees, I should say, took that recommendation up and created the art room for art history classes. Painting was taught. Some of these paintings still are at the hospital today. A lot of them were donated and then became gifts to the hospital throughout time. Salt glow bath. We all talk about, you know, what was the treatment then? You had hydrotherapy, you had salt glow. Now I see salt glow treatment is a spa treatment today. We have Pierce Hall. We still use Pierce Hall for lectures. And it's been rejuvenated very recently, but it's where they put on plays, music, but not only for patients, but for, because you had a nursing school, and so you had nursing students on campus as well. But Friday night was movie night on campus for the patients and the like. So this was a very community hub, I have to say it. Women's gymnasium basement, we had the Xander apparatus in Sweden. I call it the bicycles to nowhere, but there they were. It was part of the regimen, physical exercise. Again, the basement also housed the female baths. We have the occupational therapy room. This was in the recreation building, which was part of the men's gymnasium. And you see actually in the middle too, and I think it's probably part of this exhibit, this picture as well. Not only the loom, but you've got basket weaving and the like as well. Handicrafts, they had pottery was done. Rather extensive OT department then. Which, of course, by the 1990, it was no longer funded by life changed somewhat dramatically.
Can I ask you a question about the expression basket case?
Yeah,
Does that have anything to do with the class, or just, it's kind of a derogatory term?
derogatory.
Yes, but I'm just wondering if it somehow.
I don't believe so. I don't know it to be that. Part of our self-sufficiency here is the apples, the apple orchard. George T. Tuttle, he, interestingly enough, Edward Cowles had funded research without telling the trustees from operating budget. They did appropriate him initially $600, but he went far beyond that as he hired people and carried on the research. So Tuttle, he was his assistant back even at Boston City Hospital, came with him to McLean, became in 1904, the trustees decided that they should set a retirement age for the superintendent. Well, Edward Cowles has happened to be 64 that year. So just magically. The Board of Trustees had changed hands. There was a new chairman of the board, there were new board members, so it was different than those who had brought Cowles on in the 1870s. So Tuttle took over. They immediately took away the running of the hospital financially and gave it to Dr. Washburn and Howard down at the MGH. Tuttle carried on as the medical superintendent. He actually is the one who put in the golf course, the par 3 golf course, the skating on the pond, which I'll get to here, the upper bowl. He loved to skate, he and his wife. And, we have tennis courts. We had 3 tennis courts when I came. No, 2 tennis courts. That one actually became the parking lot outside of the Higginson house when they ended the nursing school. But there was one between where the DeMarno building is, but between the research building and the recreation building. There was one right there where everybody used to play. We had our par 3 golf course and the bowl. And in fact, there was a Sunday supplement, Boston Globe, that in the 60s that showed one of the female patients learning to golf, and it was that she was going to return to her family in country club following treatment, and she would be able to golf with her husband. So, clinical research at McLean from 1938 to about 1960. I put this in here more as something to read as I go on to talk about, insulin coma, metrazole, eventually ECT, lobotomies were done on a smaller scale. Even insulin coma and metrazole were only for a couple of years, replaced completely by ECT by 1941 as a treatment. Lobotomies were about, there's a book actually written using McLean records by a man named Jack Pressman called The Last Resort, and I highly recommend if anyone wishes to read it. It is a most judicious historical view on the subject. Our medical staff in 1938. Now, I'm going to start with on the left, the first row, Paul Howard. Paul lived to be 100. He came in January 1, 1938. He was acting clinical director, psychiatrist in chief 3 times in his career. He retired 3 times, he told me, in his career too. At age 100, he came down for his birthday and actually gave a talk and a speech. And then he passed away a month or so later playing Go with somebody in the early hours with someone in Asia, where he liked to do, because they would be up all night and his time schedule was quite right. But Paul is an amazing person. I remember asking Paul about where's your DEA license when I used to do credentialing. Looked at me and says, Terry, I got educated 1938. There are young people who know about psychopharmacology. I don't prescribe medicine, I let young people do that. But okay. Dr. Young was the staff psychiatrist then. Dr. Wood was our superintendent. I call him the family man. the man who was the person who met with the families. You see that boutonniere, he was the person who worked with the trustees, he worked with the town, during Red Cross, all that during World War II. He was very instrumental in World War II preparations. Kenneth Tillotson was the psychiatrist in chief at the time, he took Abraham Myerson's total push method to apply to schizophrenic patients, which is really more exercise involvement and post any other treatment, just to keep them moving, keep them going, and it was actually somewhat successful treatment at this time. John Whitehorn was the head of our research department. He got our first extramural grant in 1935 from the Scottish Rite Masons. He went on to replace Adolph Meyer at the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins University, and one of our senior psychiatrists, Ross Baldessarini, was a student of John Whitehorn at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Chittick was another staff psychiatrist, but behind him, Dr. Sulzbach and Weiss here on the right, in the back row, they were the insulin coma, metrazole psychiatrists who were doing that kind of clinical research. And Elvin Semrad, when he was a resident at McLean Hospital, he went on to be probably one of the more renowned psychiatrists in psychotic disorders. Dr. Peltz, I don't know where he went to. Dr. Tompkins was the physician in charge of the lobotomies. And Dr. Varney, again, was a young staff psychiatrist, I believe also a resident at that time. There's our ECT machine for that time period, high, low, and test. However, it was an advancement over insulin coma, metrazole, as it advanced over time and from anesthesia being applied to different sine waves being used to today being a very successful treatment for treatment-resistant depression. As I say, just ask, read Kitty Dukakis' book. Very much a person who had it and was a proponent of it.
Can you briefly say what the insulin treatment was?
It was more like, again, creating a coma, injecting you with that, getting into a coma state, and then bringing you back out of it.
It wouldn't be for a long period?
No, it was a very short duration. But they also realized that the effects were also short-lasting. Whereas metrazole, they tried it in a few patients, and it was actually Stanley Cobb at the MGH who, in commenting on one of the papers that was published, saying, this doesn't work. This is dangerous to the patient. There's nothing viable about this that should ever be continued. It was stopped immediately. But it was based on, like I say, they tried research. They weren't the first to bring any of this up, but they were the first ones to stop using some of these treatments. This is Alfred Pope, our first neuropathologist. This is in the first dedicated research building at McLean that was partially funded by Rockefeller money. Jordy Folchby was brought from the Rockefeller Institute to be the head of it. D.D. Van Slyke, who was a renowned physician and researcher, was the one who recommended him from New York. Alfred was a Harvard Medical School graduate and a loyal Harvard Medical School graduate throughout his entire life as fundraiser and class president alike for fundraising. Alfred studied really brain anatomy, frontal cortex in particular. I knew Alfred from being head of the library. He was head of the library committee. Just one of the last true gentlemen, as I would put it. He trained in Dr. Aub's laboratory at the MGH. This is his wife, Maria Lorenz, who was our first female clinical psychiatrist. She came in 1947 as a resident. They were married in 1950, her and Alfred. She's the one who helped advise me on when I was preparing to present to the trustees on the archives and the archival restrictions and the like, and she coached me along so I didn't make too many mistakes in my young years. She actually did research on language and the use of language and different pathologies. Her and Stanley Cobb worked together. Her residency, to tell you, was partly at McLean, and 22 months, there were 2 days at the MGH. Because McLean actually was still the outpatient part of the MGH in so many ways. We staffed it until the psychiatry department was formed there. Here's the snack bar in the visitor building for patients and nurses and staff. We have the view of the hospital, how large it was at that time. 44 buildings at one point. We had 12 single patient cottages that were built over time. Alfred Stanton replaced Dr. Woods. There was a big change because he brought in psychoanalysis, but an eclectic view of psychiatry treatment. I have to say though that psychoanalysis did have a brief period of time from about 1928 to 1931 when Moses Ralph Kaufman was the clinical director, who went on to actually found one of the founders of the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute and the first head of psychiatry at Beth Israel Hospital at that time. But then you have a biological point of view throughout. You get Stanton, who comes up from Chestnut Lodge. He's a Quaker. He's talking about milieu therapy. It's a changing philosophy for the hospital. You no longer have lobotomies. The only other outside treatment really is ECT, but also he arrives with the Thorazine coming on board in the late 1950s as a treatment, and so you start to begin to think about outpatient clinic, and not everybody has to be in an inpatient setting. And Alfred, people will say Alfred was a great clinician, he was not a good administrator, per se. And he didn't like it. And fortunately, I got to work with Alfred and get his papers in the last few years of his life. But he also was very important in doing a psychotherapy outcome study. Funded him and his protege, John Gunderson, at the time. And it proved in a negative way that, what everybody's thoughts were and conclusions, that there was something to be said about psychotherapy, but it needed to be tailored with something else as well. Irene Stiver, our first head of clinical psychology. Irene went on to establish the first psychology internship programs in the country. She went on, when she retired from McLean, went over to Wellesley, and the Jean Baker Miller Institute. She was one of the forerunners, along with Judy Jordan, of recognizing women's trauma treatment. Golda is the one, I call it the third in from the right. Molly Grove being the far right. She was our first evaluative services social worker. Joan Kotler was the assistant director of social work. Golda was our first director of social work and brought in family treatment and got families involved in the treatment at a clinical level. Golda was also involved in getting social workers independently licensed in Massachusetts. She was quite the force to be. She was a dynamite person. McLean was part of the Belmont parade, and you see Progress in Psychiatry was our float. And there was the ambulance. Horse-drawn ambulance was still around at that time as well. Here the McLean Hospital, our Sunday Globe, where I told you about the wife who was learning how to golf, but this whole supplement talks about McLean from its training to its research, and is also recognizing the opening of the new rehabilitation center with art, occupational therapy, a cafeteria that was staffed and run by patients, a gift shop. It was, and now it's our magnetic imaging, resonance imaging center with several magnets as we repurpose the facility. Francis DeMarnoff, our longest head of the hospital in its history, came to McLean in 1952 as a resident, completed his tenure as director in 1987. One of the men who hired me, actually. Francis has written 3 books on his time at McLean. One of them about his younger years of escaping the Nazis from Belgium and going to London, and he was an RAF fighter in World War II and the like. Francis was a very good administrator. Sherwood Fraser, our psychiatrist in chief, who came in 1972, was our clinical research visionary, I call him. He had a vision for where psychiatry should go, and he made it happen. He hired Jack Mendelson and Nancy Mello to form the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research Center at McLean Hospital. He brought Phil Holzman from Topeka, from Menninger, Chicago, and he got him an endowed chair at Harvard as well, but he was based at McLean for his schizophrenia research. He brought Seymour Ketty over from the MGH, who was former head of clinical director and also head of NIMH in its early years. Seymour's early research on blood circulation is why we have fMRI today. Amongst other things, he was involved in a Danish twin study for schizophrenia. It's the genetics of schizophrenia studies. He and Alfred Pope were research fellows in Professor Obb's lab back in the 1940s at the MGH. Jonathan Cole, who brought from Boston State Hospital, and then had been at Boston State, and actually was professor at head of psychiatry at Temple, brought him to McLean Hospital. He's known as the father of modern psychopharmacology. Remarkable person himself. We have a Cole Center named after him at the hospital, which is really a patient-oriented information center. And then we have a Republican president in 1990 declaring the decade of the brain and getting lots of money towards mental health research. What a different change life has done. Using some of these treatments. This is Alfred Pope, our first neuropathologist. This is in the first dedicated research building at McLean that was partially funded by Rockefeller money. Jordy Folchby was brought from the Rockefeller Institute to be the head of it. D.D. Van Slyke, who was a renowned physician and researcher, was the one who recommended him from New York. Alfred was a Harvard Medical School graduate, a loyal Harvard Medical School graduate throughout his entire life as fundraiser and class president and the like for fundraising. Alfred studied really brain anatomy, frontal cortex in particular. I knew Alfred from being head of the library. He was head of the library committee. Just one of the last true gentlemen, as I would put it. He trained in Dr. Obb's laboratory at the MGH. This is his wife, Maria Lorenz, who was our first female clinical psychiatrist. She came in 1947 as a resident. They were married in 1950. Her and Alfred. she's the one who helped advise me on when I was preparing to present to the trustees on the archives and the archival restrictions and the like, and she coached me along so I didn't make too many mistakes in my young years. She actually did research on language and the use of language and different pathologies. Her and Stanley Cobb worked together. Her residency, to tell you, was partly at McLean, and 22 months, there were 2 days at the MGH. Because McLean actually was still the outpatient part of the MGH in so many ways. We staffed it until the psychiatry department was formed there. Here's the snack bar and the visitor building for patients and nurses and staff. We have the view of the hospital, how large it was at that time. 44 buildings at one point. We had 12 single patient cottages that were built over time. Alfred Stanton replaced Dr. Woods. There was a big change because he brought in psychoanalysis, but an eclectic view of psychiatry treatment. I have to say, though, that psychoanalysis did have a brief period of time from about 1928 to 1931, when Moses Ralph Kaufman was the clinical director, who went on to actually found one of the founders of the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute and the first head of psychiatry at Beth Israel Hospital at that time. But then you have a biological point of view throughout. You get Stanton, who comes up from Chestnut Lodge. He's a Quaker. He's talking about milieu therapy. It's a changing philosophy for the hospital. You no longer have lobotomies. The only other outside treatment really is ECT, but also he arrives with the Thorazine coming on board in the late 1950s as a treatment, and so you start to begin to think about outpatient clinic, and not everybody has to be in an inpatient setting. And Alfred, people will say Alfred was a great clinician, he was not a good administrator, per se. And he didn't like it. And fortunately, I got to work with Alfred and read his papers in the last few years of his life. But he also was very important in doing a psychotherapy outcome study, funded him and his protege, John Gunderson, at the time. And it proved in a negative way that, what everybody's thoughts were and conclusions, that there was something to be said about psychotherapy, but it needed to be tailored with something else as well. Irene Stiver, our first head of clinical psychology. Irene went on to establish the first psychology internship programs in the country. She went on, when she retired from McLean, went over to Wellesley, Jean Baker Miller Institute. She was one of the forerunners, along with Judy Jordan, of recognizing women's trauma treatment. Golda is the one, I call it the third in from the right. Molly Grobe in the far right. She was our first evaluative services social worker. Joan Kotler was the assistant director of social work. Golda was our first director of social work and brought in family treatment, and we got families involved in the treatment at a clinical level. Golda was also involved in getting social workers independently licensed in Massachusetts. She was quite the force to be. She was a dynamite person. McLean was part of the Belmont parade, and you see Progress in Psychiatry was our float. And there was the ambulance. A horse-drawn ambulance was still around at that time as well. Here the McLean Hospital, our Sunday Globe, where I told you about the wife who was learning how to golf. But this whole supplement talks about McLean from its training to its research, and is also recognizing the opening of the new rehabilitation center with art, occupational therapy, a cafeteria that was staffed and run by patients, a gift shop. It was, and now it's our magnetic imaging, resonance imaging center, with several magnets, as we've repurposed the facility. Francis DeMarnoff, our longest head of the hospital in its history, came to McLean in 1952 as a resident, completed his tenure as director in 1987. One of the men who hired me, actually. Francis has written 3 books on his time at McLean. One of them about his younger years of escaping the Nazis from Belgium and going to London, and he was an RAF fighter in World War II and the like. Francis was a very good administrator. Sherb Fraser, our psychiatrist in chief, who came in 1972, was our clinical research visionary, I call him. He had a vision for where psychiatry should go, and he made it happen. He hired Jack Mendelson and Nancy Mello to form the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research Center at McLean Hospital. He brought Phil Holzman from Topeka, from Menager in Chicago, and he got him an endowed chair at Harvard as well, but he was based at McLean with his schizophrenia research. He brought Seymour Ketty over from the MGH, who was former head of clinical director and also head of NIMH. Early years. Seymour's early research on blood circulation is why we have fMRI today. Amongst other things, he was involved in a Danish twin study for schizophrenia, the genetics of schizophrenia studies. He and Alfred Pope were research fellows in Professor Obb's lab back in the 1940s at the MGH. Jonathan Cole, who brought from Boston State Hospital, and then had been at Boston State, and actually was professor at head of psychiatry at Temple, brought him to McLean Hospital. He's known as the father of modern psychopharmacology. Remarkable person himself. We have a Cole Center named after him at the hospital, which is really a patient-oriented information center. And then we have a Republican president in 1990 declaring the decade of the brain and getting lots of money towards mental health research. What a different change life has done. And from that monies, we were able to build an addition onto the Mailman Research Center and bring in a whole new young cadre of researchers. Many of whom are now at chief scientific. They've gone to, we were able to then down the road hire a new chief scientific officer, but Joseph Coyle was the first chief scientific officer there. We brought in several people. From Bill Carlos on the Quang Su Kim to Vadim Bolshakov, it was like Donald Wang, and it was like a whole new group of people with whole new ideas and the like that came in. It was sort of like the next generation of researchers. Thanks to that presidential thought in finance. We have outside of McLean, we have a few off-campus properties, this being Fernside for alcohol and substance abuse treatment. It's a country retreat in Princeton. I'm going to say that McLean now has 309 inpatient beds between the Belmont campus and our 2 locations at McLean Southeast down in Middleborough. We're starting to bring some of our off-campus programs back onto campus. We're in the process of building a brand new child and adolescent campus itself on our campus in so many ways. I have to say that Dr. DeMarnoff took the lead, him and Golda Edinburgh, back in 1960 to create the Arlington School, which is a secondary high school on campus. accredited. And now with the new child campus being built, the school will move from what used to be a single patient cottage into brand new quarters, along with all other programs will have new space as well. So this is the McLean View 2002. I had to ask the federal government for dispensation for a flyover to take, well, I had about 34 pictures taken because it was right after 9/11. So we had this done before we had the campus development of the condominiums that took place after this time period. And this is where I'm going to leave my talk today. Probably tomorrow I could give the same talk and it'll be a little different. But
Thank you so much.
Are you open to some questions?
sure.
Well, I just one question was like the decision to move from Somerville to Belmont, was that primarily because of the encroachment of the industries you kind of intimated?
Yes.
Like there was
The railroad circled the property
railroads,
completely.
And then people may not know, right at where Twin City Plaza is, there was a slaughterhouse.
Yes.
There's all sorts of industries.
Brick killing factories, all kinds of things, and they were polluting the river. And you know, there were some statements I've seen in some papers about hogs heads and whatever else, but parts being in the river and the like that. It was worse than some rivers they commented in Europe at the time, like, if I remember correctly. So yes, it was all of that. So you had the putrid smells, you had the railroad not only encircled it, it cut across the property itself. So they got awarded some money from that, which helped to start the funding to think about a new site. And then when they sold the property to the railroad, it became a railroad changing yard, right around the turn of the century, after they knocked all the buildings down. That's what.
And also flattened
they flattened the head, yes. So then that provided really the major startup funds towards new construction.
Terry, quick question. Over the years, I've heard different stories about whether Olmsted had direct hand in the actual landscape layout and planting the trees and all that. It's interesting to see that he was instrumental in the layout of the buildings.
Right.
But that's where his
Yes.
influence ended. And then later on, he passed away.
That person was Joseph Curtis.
Joseph Curtis.
I have letters from him to Shady Hill Nurseries in Cambridge, buying the trees and shrubs and the things that he was asking for. I actually just came across them about a month or two ago in construction records that I have that was sort of buried in this miscellaneous file. But there were 2 letters and exactly what he was purchasing and the like. And what kind of shades of color of leaves and the like that he was looking for. So yeah, he stays on all the way through the construction phase. He oversees the laying out of the roads, partly where the buildings are, but the buildings are sited also because of all the ledge. The ledge helped determine where some of the buildings are put in. That's why some of the tunnels are below ground and some of them are above ground on campus. Still meeting what Olmsted's idea was about having pleasure yards for the different patient populations in different buildings. And the patients were separated. North was male, south was female, until really in the 1960s. Then that changed.
Lindsay Margie Lamar wrote a paper in the 1970s that's in the archives of McLean with this detailed analysis of how much influence Olmsted had on the construction.
So I always say that Olmsted was instrumental in site selection. He had the ideas about what it should look like. We're not so far off from his original, although we have more buildings and they're spread further apart. But like I said, I believe also and Cowles wanted that cottage atmosphere. He didn't want as much as the closeness because Wyman and Bowdish being the buildings farthest out were for the more difficult patients. And then those who had more grounds privileges and the like were closer to the administration building. When I came in '81, we had one cafeteria that patients would eat at with staff, but we had to stagger because it was a smaller place. Now we have a brand new DeMarnif building with a brand new cafeteria. And yet during that time period, a lot of the food carts, they still do, certain food carts go to the units for certain meals, but a good portion of the patients do come to the cafeteria like there was back in the 80s. And it's funny that where that cafeteria was, is now where the storeroom is, the outpatient clinic is, and the like, so.
I was going to say, do you know how we got this staircase?
Actually, Mr. Shaw of Wayland, Massachusetts. Staircase, I gather there's the fireplaces downstairs. Those are the two that were eventually acquired by somebody who then donated it to the museum. But
So everybody knows where this comes from, right?
it's from the Barrow Mansion itself, designed by Bullfinch.
So this was part of McLean's
Yes.
original...
The original campus.
Yes, this is from 1792.
That's why we wanted to have the exhibition here, so it's a connection. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Oh, go ahead, one more question.
Was McLean's the first hospital of its type in the U.S.?
No, I will have to tell you that maybe upon founding date, but not opening date. Friends Hospital in Philadelphia, which predates us by 2 years, 1816. And also there's Williamsburg, Virginia, had a psychiatric hospital too. I think we're the third, quite honestly. First in New England of any kind of hospital, but third in terms of mental illness. And I learned that the Jesuits in Mexico, back in the 1500s, 1600s, had a psychiatric hospital there as well.
Oh, wow.
That early?
That early.
You mentioned you touched on ground stages.
Yes.
I was just wondering, especially back in the day, all the admissions were voluntary until a certain point?
Voluntary admissions started in 1881. Prior to that, you had to have a commitment paper from a physician. 1881, we had one patient. 1883, we had about 5 to 7, and then 10, 15 years later, 50% of the patients were voluntary. And that just became more the standard of the day. But Brown's privileges started even back with Rufus Wyman, the first superintendent. Some of the patients were took by carriage ride into Boston to attend plays and the like, and to go to museums and the like. Others were too ill to go out and pub, but that, from the very beginning, there was certainly, and even in Belmont, when we were in Belmont, they would go into town to see plays and the like, as well as bringing orchestras and choral societies and places people out to the hospital itself. One interesting fact is though, I had in 1983, I gave a talk to the Belmont senior citizens. Primarily there was a few gentlemen, but mostly women, and they all sat down and said, you know, this is the first time we've ever been on campus in our lives, as we were told as kids, you don't go anywhere on near the hill, don't go on the hill. Well, in fact, Belmont itself as a town, when we showed the slide of the Italian immigrants living on the grounds, building the buildings, we have wonderful mosaic, tile work and the like, and in fireplaces and under carpet now in certain buildings like the administration. But I said, well, there was a notice that I've seen about we needed a constable. I said, oh, that's so that nobody would come and steal all the building materials? No, that was to keep the immigrants on campus. They didn't want them in town.
Whoa.
Which led to Dr. Cowles in 1896 writing the chairman of the select board and saying, I would like you to deputize these 5 McLean people to be our security service with no compensation from the town, but that they will function as our police force and we don't need any help from the town. If we do, we will ask for it.
Keep your people from harassing our
And it was agreed to, and that was our first security force.
wait.
question.
Yes.
So that case, those documents are like the actual things of some of the pictures
Yes.
you showed us?
Yes, that's correct, yes. Mhm. And then hopefully there's a few more other than what I showed you, but yes.
There are more in that case that I shared, yeah. And then there are some other photographs in the back.
So I didn't know about the fireplace, I don't even know where it is.
It's in the basement here, down by the restrooms.
Oh,
They had just located it too and brought it out. I didn't know either. I actually, when I came today, I said, "You know where the fireplace went to?" Because I only knew that this survived. There were other pieces that showed up, but I had no idea from when, if he passed away, what happened to them.
Portions of the staircase are stored elsewhere in the museum because they couldn't fit it all.
Yeah, it was very.
Very.
Nice staircase.
very fancy. You can imagine that whole building must have been very fancy.
Yes, it was the. Everyone said it was the most lavish. And in fact, if you're interested, I have a paper that was written as part of the Radcliffe seminars by 3 students who did a whole research on Barrow and his house and some of its contents. And how they could trace and what they couldn't trace, but it's amazing what they were able to document. He had the wealth to do it.
Thank you again to everyone for coming.